Restoration movement is one of the most rich times in religious history for the United States. It's a time when larger-than-life characters took the stage. These men had grown to where they were tired of the rampant division that was caused by the denominations of their time, and they decided to work towards making a change. This is where we find what is referred to as the Restoration plea. These men sought to return to the Word of God and only the Word of God for the authority for absolutely everything that they did in their lives. This is where such phrases as calling Bible things by Bible names come from. And there's many other phrases that were coined during this time period. However, like any movement throughout the course of history, no one man is responsible for making these changes. There are almost countless individuals who began, aided, and pushed forward the changes that were brought on by this restoration movement. I have been lucky enough to be given the assignment to speak on not one but two of these men for this lectureship. This lesson we're going to focus on the life, the work, and the influence of Tolbert Fanning. Tolbert Fanning was both a figurative and a literal giant of a man. Fanning stood at 6 foot 6 inches tall and commanded the attention of any room with the power of his voice. Fanning was undoubtedly the most influential preacher of the South before the Civil War. Unfortunately, his strong stance against things which he determined to be unbiblical led many historians to downplay the significance of the life he led and the role that he played in the Restoration movement. The world into which Tolbert Fanning was born was one that was completely different than the world that we know today. And before we get into Fanning's life and the things that he did, it's important to understand a little bit about the world into which he was born, so that we can understand better his character and what type of person he was. The nation of the early 1800s was much different than it is today. Travel was still in its infancy. In fact, the steamboat had just been invented by Robert Fulton in 1807. The Erie Canal would be started in 1817 and completed in 1825. It was also during this time that James Monroe became President of the United States. And he was the one who penned the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers not to interfere with the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. This America into which Tolbert Fanning was born was rapidly changing. It was a nation that was pushing the frontier boundaries further into the West. It was not only the secular landscape that was changing, but also the religious landscape of that day. Following the end of the Revolutionary War, morals began to trend downward. As the 18th century came to a close and the 19th century dawned, this decline in morals would continue in America. Alcoholism grew rampant, and a disdain for Christ and his moral teachings became the norm for the majority of America. Luckily, what is known as the Kentucky Revival brought a ray of hope into the nation. It was into this nation undergoing a religious revival that Tolbert Fanning was born. Tolbert Fanning, as a young man, would go through so much in this changing nation. Actually, Tolbert Fanning, he was born to William and Nancy Fanning on May 10th of 1810. Both of his parents were working-class natives of Virginia. They would move further west to Canyon County, Tennessee. It is here that Tolbert Fanning would be born. It is here that his parents would live a life of frontiersmen, if you were, that they would cut down their own trees to be able to build their homes. They would cultivate their own soil and able to grow the food that they would eat. Fanning would grow up learning the importance of hard physical labor, and although he had not yet been introduced to religion, he would learn the important truth of Bible verses such as 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, where it says, "If any would not work, neither should he eat." At the age of 6, his family would leave Canyon County, Tennessee, and move to Lauderdale County, Alabama. It was during this time that Fanning would grow to the age where he would leave home. His education in early life was little to none in comparison with the education that children receive today. In his young life, work came before education, which meant that he could only attend school a few months out of the year because harvest time was more important. It also meant that only after his chores had been completed would he be able to go to school. An important characteristic of Fanning is that everyone could learn from was that he never allowed anything to hold him back. Even though he didn't have an early education, that would not stop him. Rather than remaining simple his whole life and simply complaining that he was not given the proper education, he let his lack of formal education stoke within him a desire to learn more in life and sought out education for himself. His religious education was actually lacking more than his secular education. His father was not affiliated with any religious group, and although his mother was considered Baptist, she was not strict in making her children learn about religion. This meant that between birth and 10 years of age, the only religious teaching that Fanning received was when he heard a variety of preaching from Baptists, from Methodists, and Presbyterian preachers at the town center when he was in between work and school. So his religious education was almost non-existent. Then, when Fanning was 11 years old, a new type of preaching came to town. Some men had begun teaching the one body, the one faith, and the one creed message of Christ. The restoration teachings that began by men like Barton Stone and men like Alexander Campbell, they had reached the ears of young Tolbert Fanning. Fanning began to attend meetings of the church and was able to listen to the teachings of these early restoration preachers for about 5 years. Then the turning point can be seen in young Fanning's life. It came on October in 1826. Fanning attended a meeting at Cypress Creek congregation. This was 7 miles north of present-day Florence, Alabama. It was at this meeting that Fanning had heard a lesson entitled "The Gospel and Its Convictions." He heard this from none other than Brother Benjamin Franklin, another important figure in the Restoration movement. It was after hearing this lesson that at 16 years of age, Tolbert Fanning, he went forward, he made his confession known, and he was immersed for the remission of his sins. This is when Fanning made an important decision in his life. He decided from this point forward that he wanted to work for the Lord. Fanning increased his desire to learn as much as he could about the Bible, and for the next 2 years he devoted every free moment he had to studying the Bible. He would spend all day at school or on the farm, and then write and study the Bible all night until about 2 a.m. when he would sleep for only a few hours and begin the next day at sunrise to work on the farm again. 3 years after his conversion, Fanning decided that he had to take up the important work of preaching the Word of God unto others. He began preaching in various congregations of northern Alabama and southern Tennessee in 1829. Unfortunately, his first endeavors at preaching brought about failure and much discouragement. The story of his first preaching engagement is actually a really interesting one, and it gives us another great lesson in perseverance that we can learn from Tolbert Fanning's life. While still a teenager, Fanning was already over 6 feet tall, and the modest lifestyle of his family meant that he did not have new clothes but had clothes that his parents had to make for him. So it meant that the clothes that he wore, most of the time, they didn't actually fit his rapidly growing frame. After his first time preaching, an elderly woman gave him the following advice. She said, "Brother Fanning, you can never preach and will always run your legs too far through your britches. Do go home and go to farming." This is hard to think about, but it's what happens a lot of times when people first begin preaching the Word of God. Such harsh criticism could have easily ended this young man's career as a preacher, but Fanning took it again, just as his lack of education, as something that would stoke his fire. Rather than to be discouraged by this woman's comments, he took it as a personal challenge to learn more and improve as a preacher of the gospel. He truly put into practice the words and advice that Paul wrote unto a young Timothy when he said, "Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers, in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, and in purity. Till I come, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, and to doctrine." That comes from 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 12 and 13. Now then, in November of 1831, Fanning entered the University of Nashville and would begin his official studies. Those official studies would kick off the beginning of the year in 1832 for him as he started his classes. During his time at the university, Fanning was influenced primarily by two different teachers. The first was Dr. Philip Lindsay. He was the current president of the university there in Nashville, and he was actually a previous president of Yale University. The other man was Dr. Gerard Troost. He was a well-known scientist of that day, and he was actually responsible for teaching Fanning the importance of geography. He taught him Bible geography and how important it was to being able to preach the gospel, to know where these places were that he was talking about. While Fanning engrossed himself in his studies at Nashville, he never allowed his studies to keep him from preaching. In fact, he and fellow classmate Absalom Adams, they would begin a congregation in Franklin, Tennessee, while still students. Fanning would often fill the role of pulpit preacher for the congregation at Franklin during his time at the university. As if this was not enough work to keep him busy, Fanning also began, while he was a student in school, his first editorial pursuit. While a student at Nashville, Fanning loved farming. He grew up farming, he understood what it was, and it was something that was close and dear to his heart. This love for farming led him to begin local agricultural newsletter called The Agriculturalist. He would complete his studies at Nashville University and actually graduate in 1835. We can take so many lessons from the life of men like Tolbert Fanning just by looking at how much he did to keep himself busy. He didn't sit there and just do the minimum requirement that they had at Nashville University, but he found other things to do to work for the Lord while he was a student. Upon his graduation, Fanning was ready to devote the rest of his life to working for the cause of Christ, to preaching and teaching the gospel full time. It is then that he continued on preaching for the congregation of Franklin, Tennessee for a few years. And it was while living in Franklin that Fanning married his second wife, Charlotte. This would be sister of P.S. Fall, one of Fanning's friends, in 1837. Fanning's first wife he married while he was still a student. She had actually died a few months earlier before he married his second wife. He and his new bride, Charlotte, cared greatly for the youth of Franklin and that congregation there, which led them to open an all-female academy. They opened the Eclectic Institute for Young Ladies the same year that he graduated. The school saw great success early on. It began with 60 female students in the first year, and it grew to over 100 students in year 2. Unfortunately, that success was going to be short-lived, because after only 3 years, the school would be closed due to issues with funding. The school was one that required funding from outside sources, from other Christians, and that funding just did not come through to be able to keep the school going at the rate that it was. Fanning decided that his next educational endeavor would be financially independent and not rely on outside assistance to continue, which led him and his wife to purchase a 300-acre farm in Franklin, Tennessee in 1840, but we'll come back to that point a little bit later. After struggling the first few years following his graduation, Fanning and his wife decided that some time away was in order. They had this school that they started was now closed, and the church wasn't growing as rapidly as what he had hoped, so they decided to take a trip. They began to journey south, briefly stopping in Columbia and then Lawrenceburg, where Fanning would preach in local congregations as they traveled. In 1842, the Fannings reached Russellville, Alabama, where they would stop and Tolbert would preach for a short period of time. According to Fanning, the reason why he decided to stop in Russellville and preach there was because that's where their carriage broke down. Now they would, of course, have the carriage fixed so they could continue their journeying, but Fanning would continue trips such as these all throughout his preaching career. Often he would leave home and travel to preach the gospel to various local congregations and aid them in the work for a short time. It was in 1844, only 9 short years after graduating from Nashville University, that Fanning approached the Tennessee state legislature to secure a charter for the founding of a college. In this same year, Fanning would also launch his second editorial pursuit, known as the Christian Review. Fanning was a man who kept busy all the time with his various works. In order to keep from confusing things, let us start by looking at each one of these works separately. We're going to begin by looking at the founding and success of Franklin College. Fanning had never quit planning for opening a school ever since his first endeavor had failed. He had secured 300 acres of land on which the school would be built, and he had secured a large amount of funding for the facilities, as well as a board of trustees had been gathered together made up of like-minded brethren from that area. He had worked on designing 3 separate departments for this college. It would consist of, to begin with, a juvenile department. This is where the youngest students, ages 5 through 12, would be accepted to teach primary school and Bible. There would also be a second department known as the preparatory department, which would take those that are older than 12 but not yet ready to enter college and prepare them for entry into the third department, the college proper. College proper would be a 4 years teaching at a college level. They would have all kinds of different courses. Fanning, he actually designed the curriculum to be broken down into 3 main areas as well. Fanning's love of farming and hard work ethic, which came from growing up on the farm, led him to include a physical section to the curriculum. This section would allow students to work on the farm doing physical labor. While they did this physical labor, it would allow them to earn some money towards their tuition cost. Then the second section of the curriculum, it would be known as the moral section. This would be composed of the students' Bible classes, where they would learn the content of the books of the Bible, as well as also be taught important moral principles from the Bible. The final section then would be referred to as the intellectual section. This is where the students would take traditional college courses, such as their math, their English, their science, and their history. This college at Franklin continued successfully until the time of the Civil War. In 1860, the college was forced to close its doors because the majority of the students had taken up arms to fight in the war. While closed, the college was used as barracks actually by both sides of the Civil War, first by the South and then again by the North a little bit later. After the war, Fanning was able to reopen Franklin College. Unfortunately, it then suffered another setback in the form of losing one of its main buildings to a fire. As always, Fanning persevered. He is a man who never allowed something bad to keep him from moving forward and working for the Lord. He added the neighboring Minerva College buildings to the facilities at Franklin College. These new facilities would add a girls' section to the college, and it would henceforth be known as the Hope Institute. The reason for calling it the Hope Institute was because they hoped to grow together as a unified nation and look towards hope after the carnal battle that was the Civil War. Now let us turn to Fanning's other work that began in 1844. This was his second attempt at writing a paper, the Christian Review. This Christian Review found early success and great reception throughout the brotherhood. Fanning brought in many brethren to aid him in the writing and the editing process for this paper. Just a few of these men include W.H. Wharton, H.T. Anderson, Jacob Creeth Jr., M. Winans, W.W. Stevenson, John R. Howard, W.D. Carnes, and many others. The list goes on and on of men that would write and edit for the Christian Review. Fanning knew that many would ask why there was a need for yet another brotherhood paper, so he developed 4 key reasons for beginning his new paper. First, he felt that the many opposing journals which filled the mailboxes of the people, they caused the public to have a distorted view about what churches were actually teaching. Second, he felt that the majority of parties out there did not practice in reality first century Christianity to the full extent, and the paper would hopefully lead men towards that end. Third, he felt that members of the churches of Christ as a whole were not as intelligent, as spiritual, or as zealous as what they should be. Finally, he felt that the corresponding editors of the paper spread throughout the country would provide better reporting of the nation as a whole than its sister papers. And it's for these 4 reasons that he put forth that the Christian Review needed to be started. The Christian Review was designed to deal with religious subjects. It was meant to also deal with current events going on within the church. The first issue, for instance, dealt greatly with the Rice-Campbell debate that had just occurred. It was not only this first issue, but the first few issues that dealt with this debate. Fanning's paper was essentially the first of its kind for one key reason. The majority of papers out there had articles written by one specific group or one specific denomination. The Christian Review would offer space for differing views to have an intelligent but a loving discussion of their differences, with hopes of reconciling those differences and growing together as groups following the pattern of the first century church. Fanning, who grew increasingly busy with his duties both at Franklin College and as a preacher, started to look towards somebody that he could pass on that paper to. The next man in line was an up-and-coming young preacher in the Brotherhood by the name of Jesse B. Ferguson. Fanning would look back on this decision as ultimately one of his greatest failures in life. And this is due to what is now known as the Jesse B. Ferguson incident. Jesse Ferguson would lead the paper to become the center of religious division in Tennessee. He wrote an article in the paper that was published in the paper called the Christian Review. In this article, Ferguson, he shared a belief that people were able to receive salvation not only in this life, but even after they had died. If they failed to obey God in this life, that they could receive salvation through some other means after they had died. Needless to say, this caused a large amount of division, and it eventually led to a split at the Nashville congregation where Ferguson was a preacher. This is another instance that could have easily crippled any individual. Fanning had chosen a successor for his paper, and that successor had gone on to cause division and strife throughout the Brotherhood. His spirit, however, could not be quenched. Just as it had every time in the past when something could have put him down for good, his love for the Lord and for the Word of God kept him going, making sure that he did not stop. Which is why he did not allow the Christian Review to be the last of his papers or his editorial pursuits, if you will. Fanning's third attempt at editing a paper would possibly, actually without a doubt, would be his most well-known and successful paper. It is known as the Gospel Advocate. It was in July of 1855 that he and his co-editor William Lipscomb began publication of the Gospel Advocate. Fanning sent out his stated purpose for beginning the new paper to many throughout the Brotherhood. And I'll actually read this purpose to you now. He wrote, "The Gospel Advocate will be devoted to the interest of the Church of Jesus Christ, and especially the maintenance of the doctrine of the salvation through the gospel of the grace of God. It will be the careful study of the conductors to present in an intelligible form the great and distinguishing principles of the Christian institution, and affectionately enforce the observance of its heavenly practices, to give such reviews and notices of religious systems, speculations, books, publications, and sayings and doings of men as they may to them seem proper and useful, and to keep the reader advised of religious and educational progress." As you can see, Fanning was a man who was very eloquent in his writing as well as his speech. Fanning even presented that the motto of the Gospel Advocate would be open columns and free discussion of all questions calculated to advance the spiritual interest of society. The Gospel Advocate saw immediate success and received great support from the Brotherhood. It continued publication until mailing was closed due to the Civil War. It was not able to circulate from 1861 to 1865, but it was once again able to resume circulation after the war in 1866. Upon its recirculation, the paper was changed from a monthly paper to a weekly paper. Another post-war change for the Gospel Advocate saw Fanning and not William, but his brother David Lipscomb as editors for the paper. Fanning would never truly know the longevity of this enterprise because while he died in 1874, the paper, although it continued to change editors over time, it continued its existence, and as of this lesson, it is still in existence today. Tolbert Fanning was a hard-working man who carried out more works than the majority of men. This, however, did not change the fact that he was above all else a man of principle. Throughout his life, many of his works would actually suffer because he took an unpopular stance of speaking out against things because he saw that there was no scriptural authority or no authority for what was being done found in the Word of God. From a young age, this is how Fanning was. He knew where he stood on many issues, and as he grew, his resolve to be unmoved from his beliefs became a point of contention between him and those who disagreed with where he stood. One area, for example, where he gained enemies on both sides was the area of the Civil War. Fanning led the South in the movement to keep Christians from fighting during the war, while his counterpart Ben Franklin did the same for Christians of the North. Fanning penned a letter to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, and sent copies of that letter to both the Governor of Tennessee as well as President Lincoln. I'm going to read that letter to you now. Fanning wrote, "To His Excellency the President of the Confederate States of America, whereas a large number of the members of the Churches of Jesus Christ throughout this and the adjoining counties of the state of Tennessee feel a deep sense of the responsibility they are under to recognize the Bible in its teachings as the only infallible guide of their life and the supremely authoritative rule of action, and as being a superior authority to and more binding upon the subjects of the kingdom of Jesus Christ than the rules and regulations of any human government or power, they would respectfully represent first that they are fully satisfied that God, through the scripture of sacred truth, demands of His servants that they should submit quietly, heartily, and cheerfully to the government under which they may live. In all cases except when compliance with the civil law would involve a violation of the law of God. They are deeply impressed with the truth that when there is a conflict between the requirements of worldly governments and the law of God, the duty of the Christian is upon the peril of his own well-being to obey God first. Let the consequence be to him what they may. Second, they are firm in the conviction of the truth that no man who regards the authority of God, the Spirit, and letter of the sacred scripture in their proper division and application, the life and the teachings of the Son of God or His holy apostles as given for the guidance of His followers can in any manner engage in, aid, foment, or countenance the strife, animosities, and bloody conflicts in which civil governments are frequently engaged, and in which they often involve their subjects. The measure and limit of their duty to and connection with the governments under which they live, as laid down in the sacred scriptures, is not an active participation in its affairs to destroy or upbuild, but simply a quiet and cheerful submission to its enactments. In the payment of tribute and any demands on our property or time modified only by the first and highest obligation to obey God, With these considerations of what our duty to God requires at our hands, the enforcement of the Conscript Act for the purpose of raising and maintaining an army for the carrying on of this unhappy war in which our country is involved cannot fail to work indescribable distress to those members of our churches holding these convictions. Some of them will be driven as exiles from their homes for no political preference. But because they dare not disobey the commandments of God, others may be thrown into seeming opposition to your government, suffering imprisonment and such punishment as may be inflicted on them. Others still, by the pressure of circumstances, may be driven into a deeply sadder fate, the violation of all their conscientious convictions of duty to their Maker and Master, whom they have under the most solemn vows pledged themselves to serve. In view of these things, we are induced to make a statement of these facts to you, with the hope that some relief may be afforded to those of our members thus distressed. We are the more encouraged, too, in this hope from the fact that we perceive that Congress of the Confederate States of America, with a commendable regard for the conscientious convictions of its subjects, made provisions upon certain denominations of professed Christians from the performance of requirements repulsive to their religious faith, with the view, too, that this law might not act insidiously with reference to individuals not specifically named in said act. The power was vested in the honorable President of making such further exemptions as in his judgment, justice, equity, or necessity might demand. We respectfully petition of you that members of our churches who are now and have been striving to maintain a position of Christian separation from the world, its strife and conflicts, may be relieved on terms equitable and just from requirements repulsive to their religious faith, and that they may be at least placed upon a footing similar to that in which denominations holding a like faith. Needless to say, his letter did much when it was sent to the president of both sides. His words had such an impact that both sides, they allowed Christians to abstain from fighting if they chose to do so. However, his pacifism led to contrary reactions. While some applauded him for his bravery to speak out against violence, others would actually label him as a disloyal man or a traitor to his country. Fanning also took similar unpopular stances against many other things, such as the missionary society and even full-time located preachers. Whether one agree or disagree with his stance, his strength to stand for what he believed in cannot help but draw a degree of admiration. The strength with which he approached everything in life makes the thought of his death something of a foreign concept. But even in his death, the story is one of giant proportions that almost seems made up. Near the end of his life, Fanning seemed to work with a renewed zealousness and urgency of doing as much as he could with the time that he had left. In fact, he would often quote from the Bible when people asked why he didn't settle back and retire as he grew older. He would always answer with the same verse, "I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work." John chapter 9 and verse 4. He continued this attitude of never stopping all the way into 1874, when at the age of 64, he went out to do some work on the farm. He was inspecting one of his large prized bulls. This bull in particular was dangerous on even the best of days. The bull lunged at Fanning and it violently gored the poor man. Even this did not stop him immediately. He was able to escape and make it back to his house. And he had to impatiently lay in bed for a full week, attempting to recover, which for a man who stayed as busy as he did throughout life must have seemed like torture. Finally, on April 30th, 1874, he felt well enough to get out of bed and, like always, went to the barn to do some work. It is while working in the barn that he felt a slight tear inside of him. He struggled back home and lay on his side in pain for a few more days. Then on the Lord's Day, he asked for some friends to come to his house and worship with him because he was not able to go and attend any congregation. He partook of the Lord's Supper on that occasion, and as he urged his crying friends to continue singing, he listened to them sing as he took his last breath and he departed from this life. As we mentioned in the outset of this lesson, no movement such as the Restoration Movement is the work of any one man, but it is easy to see with such hard-working men as Tolbert Fanning that such a movement could be possible. Whether it be his tireless preaching, his many brotherhood papers, or his works as an educator, Fanning greatly impacted those around them and the work of the Restoration Movement as a whole. As with every lesson, we need to look for how we can improve our lives through listening to it. A few of the many different lessons that we can take from the life of Tolbert Fanning is, first, to never allow adversity to stop us, because it is continuing through adversity that truly makes an individual unstoppable. The second is to make sure that whatever work we do it with all that we have. We do it with our might. Third, and most importantly, is that we need to look to the Word of God to shape our lives and not allow our lives to shape what we think about the Word of God. I hope that this lesson has been as beneficial for you as the study was for me. God bless. Holy